I'm just letting you know you're starting in the middle of a video. My video on self-creation is split into 2 parts. This is the second part. If you want to get to the first part, there's a link to it in the description. A man whose sense of shame has some profundity encounters his destinies and delicate decisions too on paths which few have ever reached. There are places it's only possible to go if you're willing to feel shame. But why go any of those places if I'm already content with myself? Wouldn't it be better if I just found a way to completely avoid the shame? In the same aphorism he claims the one thing that is needful is to give style to one's character, he also admits that's not the case for everybody, and he amends his proclamation. For one thing is needful, that a human being should attain satisfaction with himself, whether it be by means of this or that poetry and art. Only then is a human being at all tolerable to behold. Nietzsche's way of dealing with his shame and becoming satisfied with himself is not the only way. And he says earlier in the aphorism that there are actually some pretty cool people, but not as cool, who don't actually give themselves a single unified character. They actually delight in their own arbitrariness and enjoy just being chaos. And another possibility is someone who does unify themselves to wholeness, but then completely avoids all chaos by forcing themselves to act in a totally controlled and consistent way, and therefore avoiding the future shame of doing something you didn't expect yourself to do. These people could hypothetically avoid all shame, but Nietzsche does not personally find these paths appealing. Those moralists who command man first and above all to gain control of himself, thus afflict him with a peculiar disease. He can achieve greatness this way, but he has certainly become cut off from the most beautiful fortuities of his soul, also from all further instruction. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. For Nietzsche, all chaos and no chaos are both kind of boring. They're alright for some people, but not for Nietzsche. He doesn't just want to have a style. He wants to have an ever more unique and interesting one that incorporates as much of himself as possible. That's what he needs to be satisfied with himself. Nothing less than that will do. Full chaos means the absence of a discernible style, and no chaos means having a limited, less interesting style. Having total self-control means giving one part of yourself full control of all the other parts. The common thing amongst philosophers is to try to give full command to their quote reason unquote, and try to identify themselves solely with their so-called rational mind. For Nietzsche, this turns you into a one-dimensional character. It suppresses most of your unique and interesting qualities and gives up the opportunity to ever learn about any new ones, since the only thing allowed to express itself is your reason or whatever. If we go back to the metaphor about people being like countries, people like this are like dictatorships, where one faction has gained absolute power over all the other ones. It's the only one allowed to express itself, all others are irrelevant, and no new ideas can flourish. As opposed to that, Nietzsche thinks it's better to run yourself kinda like a democracy, where you give voice to as many of your different pieces as possible. Obviously, a lot of those parts are totally contradictory, but choosing one over the other doesn't necessarily mean keeping one and destroying the other. You can still give some expression to that part of yourself. Like maybe your career is really important to you, but you hate your boss and there's a part of you that just really wants to throw him out a window. You literally want to murder him. Those desires are definitely contradictory, but we don't have to give up either part of ourselves. We could sublimate that emotion. Rather than throwing the guy out a window, we could put up a picture of his face and throw some darts at it. That way we fed that desire without letting it step all over our other ones. Throwing the darts might even help motivate your work, making that desire complementary to your other ones, since it's helping work towards the same goal. Nietzsche isn't the kind of guy who represses an emotion because he feels like it's silly or bad to feel that way. Every emotion and desire is material to work with. The highest man would have the greatest multiplicity of drives, in the relatively greatest strength that can be endured. For Nietzsche, the most interesting person would be the person with the most inherent contradictions, who is nonetheless able to bring all those contradictions into a coherent whole, while giving expression to as many of his different parts as possible. That's not an easy thing to do and would take a pretty impressive person to pull it off. Whereas plenty of people can be the guy who's just all reason and nothing else. It can be hard to imagine somebody who is both full of contradictions and simultaneously unified. Nietzsche's example is the German author Goethe. And this is what he says about him. He was not faint-hearted, but took as much as possible upon himself, over himself, into himself. What he wanted was totality. He fought against the mutual extraneousness of reason, senses, feeling, and will. He disciplined himself to wholeness. He created himself. Alright, so hopefully at this point you kinda know what Nietzsche's trying to get at. The rest of the video is going to be some of Nietzsche's advice for how we can create ourselves. Obviously there will be some limits to that advice because he can't really tell us how we're supposed to be unique. That's going to be different for everybody. But he does have some general advice. And let's not forget that Nietzsche himself can serve as an example. He created himself through his work. He wrote a lot of different books in various literary styles, all of them about the character Friedrich Nietzsche. They don't just explore his thoughts and ideas, they also explore things like his personality and sense of humor, which are for him crucial parts of writing good philosophy. And that's a big part of the reason he's one of the few philosophers worth reading in the original. You can't get the full Nietzsche experience secondhand, like you can with some less interesting philosophers. So learn German right now and read all of his works in the original handwriting. Or maybe just start with the Walter Kaufmann translation of The Gay Science. Alright, let's get to some of that advice. We want to become those we are, human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. To that end, we must become the best learners and discoverers of everything that is lawful and necessary in the world. Therefore, long live physics, and even more so that which compels us to physics, our honesty. By physics, Nietzsche is speaking broadly about general observation of the world. Nietzsche is saying if we want to create ourselves, we better not deceive ourselves. This is the same passage where he talks about how everyone is furthest from themselves and the misconceptions that people have about intentions. If we're going to organize the different parts of ourselves, we have to be able to observe ourselves and the world clearly and honestly. But he doesn't just want us to be honest with ourselves. He also thinks we should seek after knowledge in the classic philosophical sense, though his defense of the pursuit of knowledge is different from a lot of other philosophers. For him, learning changes us. Whenever a cardinal problem is at stake, there speaks an unchangeable, "This is I." Like we already talked about, we are constantly surprising ourselves. When we experience, learn, or try anything new, we can't predict how we're going to react. And afterwards we learn something about ourselves. A part of us speaks, "This is I." For Nietzsche, this is a call to experiment. I find life truer, more desirable and mysterious every year, ever since the day the great liberator came to me. That life could be an experiment for the seeker for knowledge. Nietzsche thinks we should constantly experiment and try on different ways of life, different perspectives, different philosophies, also different kinds of food and music and art. He wants us to experiment in all domains. There's one domain in particular that Nietzsche thinks we should focus on: art. For Nietzsche, self-creation is art, so we can learn a lot from artists. This is Nietzsche's unique defense of the value of art. For him, by experiencing art that has unique style, we can better learn to give ourselves style. I'm not actually going to read this quote because my video is already too long, but you definitely should. It's pretty good. Now for the importance of solitude and friendship. We, children of the future, how could we be at home in this today? We prefer to live on mountains, apart, untimely, in past or future centuries. You don't literally have to live on a mountain, but for Nietzsche it's important that we are comfortable with solitude, because there's some thinking you can only do when you're alone, and if you don't know how to be alone, you are always susceptible to social shame. Remember that for Nietzsche, private shame is important, but public, everybody staring at you kind of shame is just bad. Because enough of that social pressure will make you do anything, things you would never do by yourself. Obviously, society places huge limits on who you can be and what you can think, and what society values about us is often different from what we value about ourselves. Society is pleased to feel that the virtue of this person, the ambition of that one, and the passion of the third provide it with a dependable instrument that is always at hand. Society honors this instrumental nature. What I value in strangers is very different from what I value in myself or in my friends. Honestly, I want the waiter serving my food to be polite, useful, and boring. I don't want him to have a bunch of dimensions I need to learn about. I want him to get me my soup. But I want my friends to be interesting. I don't need them to be polite or useful, because what I get out of them is them. They help with self-creation by being interesting people, and by wanting me to be interesting. You do need to be alone sometimes to think freely, but too much solitude would kill you if you didn't have friends. No one who has true friends can know what true solitude means, even if the world surrounding him should consist entirely of adversaries. And that's one of the most important pieces of help that Nietzsche gives us. He's our friend that wants us to be more interesting. When society's bearing down on us or we're just being too lazy to follow our own principles, he's sitting in the back of our heads saying, hey man, become the person you is. Alright, I don't really know how to end this video, so we're going to talk about one last piece of advice, which is that Nietzsche thinks we should know how to end. Masters of the first rank are revealed by the fact that in great as well as small matters, they know how to end perfectly. Whether it is a matter of ending a melody or a thought, or the fifth act of a tragedy or an action of state. The best of the second rate always become restless as the end approaches, and do not manage to slope into the sea in such proud and calm harmony as, for example, the mountains at Portofino, where the Bay of Genoa ends its